On the night I dressed carefully for my son's anniversary dinner, I told myself it would be a celebration, not a battlefield. I pinned my silver brooch with trembling hands, reminding myself this was supposed to be a night of love and family. But when I stepped into that glowing Charleston restaurant, I felt the weight of every chandelier above me, every laugh from the tables around, only to realize there was no chair, no welcome, not even my name written down. 10 seats gleamed under the light, every one of them taken, but none for me. My daughter-in-law's polished smile cut sharper than any blade, a reminder that I had been quietly erased from the family I had built with my own hands. And in that moment between the candlelight and the clinking of glasses, I stood at a crossroads, break down in front of them all, or hold tight to the only thing they could never strip away from me, my dignity. What I didn't know then was that this dinner, the one meant to humiliate me, would unravel secrets worth $50,000, expose lies carefully buried, and turn me from the forgotten guest into the guest no one could ever erase. I had pressed the navy dress the night before, the one I only wore for occasions that carried weight, occasions where I wanted to feel like I still belonged. As I pinned the silver brooch to my scarf, I reminded myself this was my son's anniversary dinner, not a battlefield, not a test of loyalty, just a celebration. Still, my hands shook as I fastened the clasp. 5 years of marriage for Daniel and Savannah was something to mark, and I wanted to be present to show that no matter the distance that had grown between us, I was still here. The drive from my small house in Mount Pleasant into downtown Charleston felt longer than usual. The late afternoon sky spilled orange and pink across the marshes as I crossed the Ravenel Bridge, the city skyline pulling me forward. My heart fluttered with nerves. I rehearsed in my head what I would say when I saw them. "Congratulations. You both look so happy." "I love you, Daniel." But the words felt stiff as though my tongue might betray me with bitterness. I wanted to keep it warm, keep it simple. Maison Charleston stood proud on King Street, its brick facade lit by lanterns' windows glowing with the promise of warmth and good food. Couples strolled by laughing in their evening clothes. I gave my keys to the valet, smoothed my scarf, and told myself to breathe. Inside, the dining room was alive. The air smelled of rosemary and roasted lamb garlic sizzling in butter, fresh bread breaking at tables. Candlelight shimmered against glassware. Waiters glided between tables with trays held high, their shoes silent against the polished wood floor. The hum of conversation filled the room, punctuated by bursts of laughter, the clink of silverware, the deep notes of a cello drifting faintly from the speakers. The maitre d', a young man in a sharp black suit with hair perfectly combed, approached me with a practiced smile. "Good evening, ma'am. May I have the name of your party? My son Daniel Mitchell anniversary celebration," I said. He glanced at the reservation list, pen-poised expression easy at first. I watched his brow crease. He ran his finger down the page again, slower this time. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The reservation is listed for 10 guests, all accounted for. I don't see your name." A small laugh slipped out of me, thin and unconvincing. "That can't be right. I'm Daniel's mother." The maitre d's polite smile didn't falter, though his eyes betrayed discomfort. "I understand, but the list shows no additional seating. Perhaps there has been a mistake." My chest tightened. A mistake? The word echoed in my head. I turned, scanning the room, and saw them at once. The long oak table near the center of the room glowed under the chandelier set with polished silver and fine china tall glasses catching the light. 10 seats each filled. Daniel sat in the middle, his dark suit crisp, his brown hair neatly combed, his arm draped lightly around Savannah. She looked flawless, her blonde hair twisted into a sleek knot, a strand of pearls gracing her neck. Friends and relatives surrounded them, raising glasses, laughter spilling in waves. And there was no seat left for me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I walked closer. Savannah's eyes caught mine. For a split second, something flickered there, then her face smoothed into a smile. "Oh, Clara, I didn't know you were coming. I thought maybe you decided not to attend." Her words were sweet on the surface, like honey poured over glass, but underneath they cut sharp. Daniel looked up, his smile hesitant thin, as though he wasn't sure whether to stand or stay in his chair. "Of course I came," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I wouldn't miss my son's anniversary." Aunt Lorraine, sitting 2 seats down, shifted uncomfortably, her fork pausing midair. She glanced at me, then quickly at Savannah before fixing her eyes on her plate. A man I didn't recognize chuckled politely as though trying to ease the tension before sipping his wine. The maitre d' hovered at my shoulder, waiting for direction. "Ma'am, shall I check again?" I shook my head. "No, thank you." "It's fine." Savannah tilted her head, her voice carrying easily. "I'm sure it was just an oversight. You know how busy these things get." I felt the sting in her words. Oversight. As though I were a misplaced fork, an item forgotten on a grocery list. My hands trembled, but I clasped them tightly in front of me, hiding the shake against my scarf. Inside, something cracked, the hope I had carried with me tonight splintering into pieces. Still, I would not give her or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Daniel shifted in his chair, his lips parting as if to speak, but Savannah's hand rested lightly on his arm, her nails gleaming under the chandelier. He stilled silent. The message was clear. Around the table, the laughter rose again. Glasses clinked, forks scraped against porcelain. Conversations resumed, weaving around me as if I were invisible, a shadow standing on the edge of their celebration. I remembered another dinner long ago when Daniel was 10. We had gone to a small seafood place on Shem Creek, just the 2 of us. He had looked at me across the table, face glowing from the lantern light, and said, "Mom, when I grow up, you'll never be alone." The memory stabbed deep, colliding with the sight of him now sitting just a few feet away. His gaze lowered, unable to meet mine. I forced my feet to move to carry me back toward the maitre d'. "Thank you for your help," I said quietly. "Enjoy your evening." Each step away from the table felt heavy, like wading through water. My shoes tapped softly against the floor, each sound echoing my resolve. My heart pounded my throat tight, but my back stayed straight. I passed couples laughing, a waiter carrying champagne, a young girl twirling near her parents' table. Life went on around me, unaware of the storm beneath my skin. I paused near the entrance, my eyes drawn one last time to the glowing table. Daniel laughed at something a guest said, though I could see the stiffness in his smile. My son caught between 2 worlds, so close, yet impossibly far. I pulled my scarf tighter around my shoulders. Dignity would be my answer. No anger, no scene. Just silence, a silence that spoke louder than any protest. With my head held high, I stepped into the lobby's light, leaving behind the table where I had no place. The hush of the lobby wrapped around me, a softer world than the bright clatter I had just left behind. For a moment, I stood still, letting the faint scent of lemon polish and the low hum of distant conversation remind me that silence can be its own kind of strength. A couple walked past with coats damp from the rain, their laughter echoing faintly, and I let my eyes follow them to the door as if it might steady me. I was not going to break down in front of strangers. If I had learned anything in 56 years, it was how to hold myself upright when the world tried to make me small. The ache of being dismissed lingered, though, and memories rushed in uninvited, pulling me backward through time. I thought of Columbia, South Carolina, where I grew up in a cramped apartment above a pawn shop that smelled of dust and metal. My mother, Mary, worked herself thin at the diner every morning, then scrubbed floors and polished furniture in houses that would never be hers. She came home with cracked hands and tired feet, but she carried herself like a queen. She used to say that dignity was the one possession no one could steal. I clung to that lesson the way some children cling to a blanket. We never had much. Dinner was often beans stretched across 3 nights, or rice flavored with nothing but salt and butter. I remember sitting at the table with homework spread beside a bowl of canned peaches, the fan pushing warm air around in circles. I dreamed of more, but I also understood early that life did not hand it over easily. You earned it by keeping your word, by standing tall, by refusing to let people write you out of the picture. That resolve carried me through school. I pieced together scholarships and part-time jobs, ironing uniforms in a laundry room that steamed like a greenhouse and manning the desk of a budget hotel on the interstate. I watched weary travelers pass through with their stories written on their faces, some looking for directions, some for kindness, some for a moment of recognition. By the time I graduated and found myself in Charleston, I believed I had earned the right to belong anywhere. It was there I met Thomas Mitchell laughing at a collapsed umbrella in the middle of a hurricane warning. He had a way of turning chaos into something funny, and I was drawn to it. We married without much fuss and built a life filled with small joys. Our son Daniel was born on a blistering July afternoon when the hospital hallways smelled of antiseptic and melting popsicles. For 12 years, Thomas was the anchor of our family until that morning in 2005, when a truck ran a light on a wet street and everything shattered. The police officer who delivered the news could not look me in the eye. Daniel was 12, still soft around the edges, and I had to be both mother and father from then on. I patched drywall, filled out insurance forms, and hid my shaking hands so he would believe we could survive. We did. Daniel grew tall and handsome, polished in a way I sometimes did not recognize. He put on suits that fit him like they were made for someone else's son. I told myself that was good, that my job was to give him a life beyond survival. Still, the ache never left. The distance between us began then, and though I tried to bridge it with love and encouragement, I could sense that he carried my sacrifices differently than I had intended. Work became my shield and my pride. I ran a boutique hotel near the Battery teaching staff to treat each guest as though they were the only one. When the property was sold in 2015, I stepped into consulting. It sounded glamorous, but really it was just me and a notebook full of observations. I told the truth about what I saw even when owners bristled. That was how I met Chef Damian Torres. His first restaurant on Meeting Street was dazzling but hollow. Plates looked like paintings, but the dining room felt like a museum, cold and unwelcome. A friend dragged me there one night, and I saw at once what was wrong. The guests were stiff, afraid to touch the art in front of them. Before I left, I scribbled a note on my card. "The food is beautiful, but your guests are afraid." He called the next morning. He said he heard I was honest. I said honesty was the only thing I had to offer. We spent mornings at the market, him talking about the taste of childhood memories, me talking about the psychology of a dining room. He wanted reverence. I asked for warmth. I suggested he cut the menu to its heart ad, back a playful amuse-bouche that disarmed people, lower the flowers so guests could see one another, and teach servers to place the first plate with enough space for a smile. He resisted, then relented. Slowly the room softened, laughter returned, and people lingered over dessert. It was not enough to save the place financially, but it proved something to both of us. When Damian closed that first restaurant, he called me from the dust of his new dream, Maison Charleston. He wanted a place that lived and breathed with the city, not just with his artistry. We walked through the unfinished space blueprints curled on folding tables, and I pointed to a corner near the kitchen. "Put a special table there," I said, "one that feels like the heart of the room." He grinned and said, "A chef's table." I told him to make it close enough for guests to feel the heat, but safe enough to relax. We sketched it on a napkin, and he kept the napkin pinned above his desk for months. When Maison Charleston opened, it thrived. Guests came in suits and in denim, and all felt equally welcome. The food honored its roots, and the service invited people to belong. Damien became a star, but he never forgot those early conversations. He told me once that I was the only one who could tell him what to do without making him bristle. I laughed and told him hospitality was about seeing people, and once a room learns to see it, will not forget. Now here I was in the lobby of that very place, treated as if I were invisible. The sting cut deep, but beneath it lay the knowledge of what I had helped build. That dining room's hum, the laughter floating over wine glasses, the delight of a shared dessert, all of it carried traces of my hand. Being erased from my family's table hurt, but I could not erase myself from a space I had helped shape. I smoothed my dress and walked to the host stand. The maitre d' looked startled to see me. He offered a quick apology, but I kept my voice calm. "Is Chef Torres in tonight?" I asked. He nodded and said he was. Would I like to leave a message? I gave my name and asked if he could spare me a moment. He hesitated, then disappeared behind a velvet curtain. As I waited, I watched the room through the glass partition. A couple leaned over a chocolate dome that cracked open with steam, laughing as the surprise revealed itself. A table of young women clinked glasses, celebrating something unseen. Ordinary beauty filled the space, the kind that reminded me why I loved this work in the first place. I touched the brooch at my collar and thought of my mother, her tired hands, her quiet dignity. Then the curtains stirred. Footsteps approached, purposeful and quick, carrying the scent of rosemary and seared lamb. My pulse steadied not with fear, but with the calm certainty that I was about to be seen again, not as an afterthought, but as a part of something I had once helped bring to life. Family closeness had never come easy after Daniel married Savannah, but it was only in looking back that I saw how steadily the distance grew. Their wedding in the spring of 2018 had been beautiful on the surface, magnolia blossoms in Charleston's warm air, her gown catching the afternoon sun like a halo. I smiled through every photo and clapped when they shared their first dance, but even then I felt something shift, as if a wall had been set between us that no one would name. I told myself it was just the natural course of marriage, a son cleaving to his wife, but in truth, it was more than that. Holidays became the first test. That first Thanksgiving after their wedding, Daniel called with his voice careful and measured. "Mom, we're going to spend this year with Savannah's family in Greenville." I tried to keep my tone light when I told him I understood that young couples needed to spread their wings. The truth was, I cooked the full dinner anyway, turkey and sweet potatoes, pumpkin pie cooling on the counter, setting the table for one. The silence in that house was heavier than any hunger. Christmas was much the same. I was invited, but only on Christmas Eve, as if the real celebration happened without me on Christmas morning. Savannah's parents were always there, smiling from framed photos, their names stitched into stockings hung beside Daniel's fireplace. My stocking was missing. No one said it, but I felt it. By the time Emily was born in 2015 and Jacob in 2017, I thought perhaps the arrival of grandchildren would draw me closer. Instead, the gap widened. When Emily turned 5, I was told there would be a small birthday gathering. I drove over with a wrapped dollhouse, one I had saved for months to buy. Savannah opened the door surprised. "I thought we said just family," she remarked, even though I was family. Inside, the living room was filled with balloons, and Savannah's friends, women I did not know, calling themselves aunties to my granddaughter. I watched Emily blow out her candles, and I clapped with the rest, but when she looked around at the circle of faces, she didn't look for me. That night, I drove home with the dollhouse left behind and the echo of Savannah's words in my ears. Visits with the children were rationed like medicine. An hour here, a rushed brunch there. I learned to read to Emily from the back seat of my car while Savannah checked her phone nearby. Jacob would tug at my sleeve, asking to play, only to be pulled away because it was nap time or because they had another appointment. Slowly, my role as grandmother became that of a guest, then of a stranger hovering on the edge of photographs. It was not only distance, but also suspicion that began to grow. One evening when I stopped by unexpectedly to drop off a casserole, I noticed papers scattered on the kitchen island. Daniel had stepped out to take a call. Savannah was upstairs, and my eyes fell on the documents. They were property transfers, notarized but strange, the Mitchell family house listed with unfamiliar signatures. My late husband Thomas had left certain assets carefully structured with trusts meant for Daniel's security, and yet here were pages showing changes, new names scribbled in margins. Before I could study further, Savannah's voice carried down the stairs, and I stepped back, slipping out quietly before questions could be asked. That night, I sat with the memory of those papers tracing in my mind, the way the ink had looked too fresh, the way Daniel's signature seemed guided rather than natural. I wondered if he understood what he was signing, or if Savannah's smooth explanations drowned out his doubts. My son had always trusted too quickly, always believed love was reason enough. It was a quality I had cherished in him as a boy, but as a man it frightened me. The isolation became sharper as time passed. Invitations stopped arriving. Photos of family trips surfaced on social media, Savannah's smiling parents holding my grandchildren at the beach, their captions calling it tradition. I was nowhere in the frame. When I asked Daniel about it, he spoke gently, almost apologetically. "Mom, it's just easier sometimes." I wanted to scream that I had raised him alone, that there had been nothing easy about it, but the words caught in my throat. I tried to keep my dignity. I baked cookies and dropped them at their door, only to have them returned uneaten with a polite text that the kids had allergies. I offered to babysit to help with school pickups, but there was always an excuse. Slowly, the message sank in. They wanted me distant, quiet, erased. What unsettled me most was not the outright rejection, but the subtlety of it, the way each move was cloaked in civility. Savannah never raised her voice. She smiled. She thanked me. She spoke sweetly while guiding me toward the door. Daniel rarely contradicted her, his silence a kind of consent. It was not cruelty in the open, but a careful erasure, as if I were being written out of a script line by line, until only blank space remained. One Sunday, I sat alone in the church pew where I once held Daniel's hand as a child. The hymn rose around me, but I could not sing. I felt the full weight of their design, the way it wrapped itself around me, like smoke invisible yet suffocating. I was not just excluded by accident. I was being managed, contained, reduced to a role so small it could vanish without notice. That realization settled deep in my chest, heavier than grief. It was not chance, it was intention. The isolation was not clumsy, but deliberate, crafted with care. And as I walked out of the church that morning into the sharp Charleston sunlight, I understood something I had resisted admitting for years. I was not losing my family by mistake. I was being pushed out carefully, relentlessly, until there was no space left for me at all. The clinking of silverware against china filled the dining room, blending with soft jazz from a trio in the corner. From my seat near the edge of the lobby, I watched as servers glided gracefully between tables, carrying trays of seared scallops and crystal glasses of wine. The celebration was in full swing, laughter rising in bursts from Daniel and Savannah's table. It might have seemed like a flawless evening to anyone else, but my eyes caught the subtle stiffness in Daniel's shoulders, the way he checked the door every few minutes as if waiting for someone he dreaded. That someone arrived not long after. A tall young man entered the restaurant with the kind of confidence that tried too hard. His suit was sharp navy, fitted a little too snugly. His tie patterned boldly, and a watch gleamed on his wrist as though he wanted the whole room to notice. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted quickly from table to table, restless, carrying the look of someone with more worries than pride. I recognized him immediately from family gatherings where his presence was rare but unsettling. Ethan Carter, Savannah's younger brother. 27, too smooth for his own good with charm that always seemed to mask something else. He strode into the room like he belonged there, though I knew he had not been invited. The maitre d' hesitated, but Ethan brushed past him with a smile that was more performance than politeness. Guests at Daniel's table shifted as he approached. Savannah's expression flickered surprise laced with irritation, though she recovered quickly, kissing her brother on the cheek and murmuring something I could not hear. Daniel rose stiff and uncertain, his jaw tight, as Ethan leaned in close. They moved slightly away from the table toward a quieter corner near the wine display. I stood far enough not to be noticed, but close enough to catch fragments. Ethan's voice was smooth but laced with urgency. He spoke about an investment, his words low but fast. I heard the number 50,000 slip out between them, sharp and undeniable. Daniel's face tightened further, his smile faltering. He glanced back at the table at Savannah, at the guests who were laughing too loudly to notice. But not everyone was distracted. A couple seated nearby looked up curious, catching enough of the words to raise their brows. Ethan's tone grew more insistent. "You owe me," he said, his voice dropping but carrying just far enough. I caught the flash of anger in Daniel's eyes, quickly masked as he whispered back too softly for me to make out. I felt my stomach twist. $50,000. It was no small sum, and it was not a casual debt. My son had never been reckless with money when he lived under my roof. He had learned from me how to stretch a dollar, how to make bills balance even when life pressed hard. If he was in debt to Ethan, it meant something had gone wrong, something far deeper than a misstep. Ethan leaned back, flashing a grin that did not reach his eyes. He clapped Daniel on the shoulder as if they were sharing a joke, but the tension in Daniel's stance betrayed anything but humor. Guests nearby whispered now, the words debt and money floating just enough to stain the air. Savannah caught the ripple and shot her brother a glare that might have cut glass. Ethan only smirked, clearly pleased with the disruption. I watched Daniel try to compose himself, returning to the table with a glass of wine he did not drink. Savannah hissed something at Ethan under her breath, her hand tightening around his arm before she released him. The room had not fully noticed, but I had. I saw the cracks. I saw how my son's composure faltered under the weight of whatever entanglement he had stepped into with Ethan. My heart sank with a mix of fear and fury. This was not just a careless brother-in-law making noise. This was leverage, a hold over Daniel that could explain so much. The papers I had glimpsed on their kitchen island came back to me now with sharper clarity. Property transfers, odd signatures, changes that felt forced. Was Ethan behind that? Was Savannah complicit? My mind raced with questions that had no answers yet, only suspicions that settled like stones in my chest. I kept my eyes on them as the evening pressed forward. Daniel laughed too loudly at a toast, his voice carrying the brittle edge of a man trying to distract from his own panic. Ethan lingered near the table, drinking champagne he had not been offered, charming a few guests who clearly wondered why he was there. The tension between brother and sister pulsed like a current beneath the surface. The children, Emily and Jacob, sat at the far end of the table with crayons and paper provided by the restaurant staff. They were too young to understand, but I saw Emily glance at her father with concern, noticing more than anyone gave her credit for. Jacob tugged at Savannah's sleeve, asking for attention, but she brushed him off, her eyes fixed on Ethan with mounting frustration. I felt the urge to step forward to confront them all, to demand answers. But years of being pushed aside held me back. I stayed still, my breath steady, my eyes sharp. Observing had always been my strength, the ability to see the things others tried to hide. Tonight was no different. What I witnessed was not just family tension. It was the outline of a deeper scheme, one that threatened to swallow my son whole. The jazz trio shifted into a slower tune, trying to smooth the air, but the discord remained. Ethan leaned in to whisper once more to Daniel, who stiffened like a man cornered. A guest at the next table turned his head deliberately, pretending to sip his wine while listening closely. The whispers would spread as they always did in Charleston society. Money troubles, debts, obligations whispered behind manicured hands. I sat back in the shadows, my heart heavy but my mind sharpening. This was no simple family quarrel. Ethan's presence was deliberate, his timing too precise to be accidental. He had chosen this celebration to press his claim, to remind Daniel of his debt in the most public way possible. It was a warning dressed as conversation, and it left my son rattled, his composure fraying in front of people who would not forget. As the evening wore on, the clinking of glasses and laughter tried to smooth over the edges, but I could not unsee what I had seen. Daniel was trapped. Ethan was tightening the noose, and Savannah's silence spoke volumes about where her loyalties lay. From my place in the shadows, I understood with chilling clarity that this was not only about money, it was about power, control, and the slow unraveling of the family I had fought my whole life to protect. The air in the dining room felt heavier after Ethan's arrival, as if the tension had seeped into the polished wood and crystal glass. I stayed quiet near the entrance, watching my son struggle to maintain composure, while Savannah's brother prowled around the table like a shadow no one had invited. For a moment, I considered slipping out into the Charleston night, letting the laughter and whispers fade behind me. But something inside refused to give in. I had already been treated like I did not belong, erased from a family I once held together, and I could not allow myself to vanish so easily. The maitre d' approached cautiously, his polite smile strained. "Ma'am, would you like me to arrange another table for you?" His voice was gentle, almost apologetic, as though he had seen more than he should. I held his gaze and spoke quietly. "Would you let Chef Damien know that Clara Mitchell is here? Tell him I'd like to speak with him if he has a moment." The young man hesitated, clearly unsure, then nodded quickly and disappeared toward the kitchen. My pulse beat hard against my throat. It had been years since I had seen Damien Alvarez, yet I knew he would remember. There are some bonds that time cannot dull, even when life pushes people into different worlds. Moments later, the double doors of the kitchen swung open, and Damien stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his chef's jacket still crisp despite the heat behind him. His dark hair had gone streaked with gray since I last saw him, but the spark in his eyes was the same. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on me. His face lit up, and before I could take a breath, he was striding across the floor, ignoring the servers and guests who turned to look. Clara. My God, Clara Mitchell. He pulled me into an embrace, warm and unhesitating, the kind that comes from shared history. The room seemed to pause. Conversation slowed, forks hovered, and more than a few heads turned to watch the owner of Maison Charleston greet the woman who moments ago had been treated like an intruder. I laughed softly, still caught off guard. "It's been a long time, Damien." "Too long," he said, holding me by the shoulders as if to convince himself I was real. "Do you all know who this is? This woman saved me once. Back in 2006, when Maison Charleston was on the edge of closing, she sat in this very kitchen with me, going through every dish, every idea. Without her advice, this place wouldn't even be standing today." The words spilled into the air, unpolished and sincere. Gasps rose from a few nearby tables. I saw Savannah's face stiffen, her smile faltering for the first time all evening. Daniel froze wineglass in hand while Ethan narrowed his eyes, his easy smirk briefly unsettled. Damien turned to the maitre d'. "Clear a seat for her at the chef's table right by the kitchen. She belongs there more than anywhere else tonight." A waiter hurried to set the place. The chef's table sat just steps away from the swinging doors of the kitchen, a long counter of polished wood where only a select few ever dined. From there, guests could see the fire of the stoves, hear the quick call and response of the cooks, and be treated like royalty. I had only ever sat there once before, years ago, when Damien insisted I taste the new menu he had built from my suggestions. He gestured toward it now, his hand firm on my back as though guiding me onto a stage. "You are our special guest tonight." My throat tightened, but I smiled and let him lead me. The air near the kitchen was filled with sizzling butter and roasted garlic, sharp and alive. Servers moved around me gracefully, and for once I was not in their way. I was meant to be there. As I sat, Damien raised a glass of wine and toasted me, his voice carrying enough to reach the other tables. "To Clara, the woman who helped Maison Charleston become what it is today." Glasses lifted reluctantly across the room. Some clapped politely, others whispered. From where I sat, I could see Savannah's forced smile, her pearls catching the light, but her eyes cold as winter. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, while Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying me with calculating interest. For the first time that evening, I did not feel invisible. I felt the warmth of respect that I had not expected, not asked for, but deeply needed. It was not revenge, not yet, but it was something solid. A reminder that I still mattered, that my presence could not be erased, no matter how hard Savannah tried. The staff served me a plate directly from the kitchen's seared salmon with lemon butter, the kind of dish I had once encouraged Damien to keep simple, to trust the flavor of the fish. He winked as he set it down himself, ignoring the whispers that rippled around us. I lifted my fork slowly, tasting the food with deliberate calm. Around the room, conversations returned to life, but I could feel the shift. People had noticed. I was no longer the forgotten guest. I had been placed at the very heart of the restaurant where only the most honored sat. The celebration at Daniel and Savannah's table pressed on, but the tension was thicker now. Every laugh sounded just a bit too loud, every gesture a little too sharp. I watched them from across the room, my son glancing toward me when he thought no one else was looking. His eyes held confusion, perhaps guilt, and something else I could not yet name. Savannah whispered to Ethan with a strained smile, her hand gripping his arm like she needed his assurance. I sipped my wine, steadying myself. This moment was not a victory parade. It was only the beginning, a quiet declaration that I would not disappear no matter how hard they tried to write me out. The real reckoning was still to come, but for tonight I allowed myself the small satisfaction of knowing that dignity had carried me further than bitterness ever could. The kitchen doors swung open again, and the night moved forward, the air humming with possibility. The candlelight flickered across the polished counter of the chef's table, and I let the warmth of it ease the tightness in my chest. The salmon melted on my tongue with the same lemon butter recipe I had once urged Damien to trust years ago. He passed by, often dropping a quiet word to the line cooks, offering me a subtle nod, as though reminding the room of my place without making a spectacle. I appreciated that. It was his way of honoring me without embarrassing my son or feeding Savannah's sharp tongue with more ammunition. A server refilled my glass with a deep red Bordeaux, and the first sip carried me back to nights when I would study recipe books at my kitchen table while Daniel slept in the next room. For a fleeting moment, I felt proud again, like the years had folded in on themselves and delivered me to this chair not as an outsider, but as someone who had left a mark. A rustle beside me broke the spell. Aunt Lorraine, dressed in a floral jacket, far too bold for the occasion, eased herself into the chair next to mine. She was Daniel's late father's older sister, a woman who always spoke her mind no matter the cost. She leaned closer, her perfume of lilac and powder rising around her. "Well now, Clara," she whispered, "it looks like you're sitting in the best seat in the house. And judging by Savannah's face, that's worth more than the wine in your glass." I smiled faintly, lowering my voice. "I didn't ask for this, Lorraine." She chuckled, patting my hand. "Of course you didn't. But sometimes life has a way of putting people right where they belong. And tonight, darling, you belong right here." Her words steadied me even as I felt the weight of eyes from across the room. I did not need to look up to know that Savannah was watching, her jaw tight, her hand clamped on her wineglass like she could squeeze it into shards. Daniel sat beside her, shifting uneasily, caught between his mother and his wife, while Ethan whispered something into Savannah's ear that made her glance quickly toward me again. Damien returned briefly, laying a small plate before me with a flourish. "Braised short rib with rosemary, one of your ideas," he said softly. His voice meant for me alone. "Do you remember telling me to focus on comfort, not just elegance?" I nodded, touched by his recollection. "I remember." "Good," he said, straightening. "Because some of us never forget who helped us when no one else would." He moved away quickly, but the message lingered. A couple nearby leaned closer, murmuring their curiosity piqued. The ripple of attention spread, subtle but impossible to ignore. Lorraine leaned toward me again, her eyes twinkling. "Did you hear that? He is telling everyone without telling everyone. Savannah must be boiling." I allowed myself the smallest smile, though inside my heart raced. This acknowledgement was gentle, controlled, but it was building something larger. I could feel it like the low rumble of a storm on the horizon. The evening pressed on, servers gliding between tables, with dishes that gleamed under candlelight. Laughter rose here and there, but it felt more forced now. I noticed the glances directed my way, half curious, half uncertain. For years, I had been excluded from holiday meals, pushed to the periphery of my own family. Yet here, I sat in a place of quiet honor, and they could not ignore it. Emily and Jacob. My grandchildren peeked over from their seats at the main table. Emily waved shyly, her curls bouncing, and Jacob grinned before Savannah nudged them back to their plates. My chest ached at the distance, but warmed at their recognition. No matter what walls Savannah built, children had a way of seeing through them. Lorraine caught the moment, too. "They adore you," she said. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." I sipped my wine slowly, choosing not to answer. Words would have only made the ache sharper. The tension at the main table began to shift into something noticeable. A couple of guests leaned toward each other, their whispers too quick to be casual. I heard one say, "Isn't that the owner with her? I thought she wasn't even invited." Another replied, She must be important if she's sitting there. I kept my head high, pretending not to notice, but each word fed a quiet resolve inside me. Savannah lifted her glass in a too bright toast to the room, thanking everyone for coming, her voice quivering just enough that I caught it. She avoided mentioning me, avoided even glancing my way, though every guest knew I was there. The omission was louder than acknowledgement, and I saw Daniel's eyes flick nervously in my direction. Lorraine's lips tightened. "She's pretending you don't exist," she muttered. "That won't last much longer." The next course arrived scallops with saffron cream, a delicate dish Damien had perfected after I once suggested pairing seafood with something unexpected. He leaned in again, speaking quietly. "This one was your idea too." My throat caught as I tasted it, the flavors bright familiar. I remembered the evening years ago when I told him not to fear boldness when he had doubted himself, and I had pushed him to trust. To see that part of myself carried on the plate before me filled me with both pride and sorrow. Across the room, Savannah's smile cracked as guests looked toward my end of the restaurant. She whispered fiercely to Ethan, her hand slicing the air. He gave a tight nod, though his gaze lingered on me longer than I liked, as if measuring how much of a threat I could be. I sat taller, refusing to flinch. I had been silenced too long, left out of photographs, overlooked in invitations, erased from celebrations. Tonight the tide was shifting, not with noise or grand announcements, but with each dish placed before me, each quiet word from Damien, each curious glance from the other tables. Lorraine touched my arm, her voice low but steady. "Let them stew, Clara. You just keep sitting here letting the truth speak louder than anything Savannah could plan." The music from the live quartet drifted through the air, smooth and steady, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. It was not yet the explosion I knew was coming, but it was enough to make everyone at the main table shift uneasily in their seats. I breathed in slowly, letting the scent of rosemary and saffron ground me. The night was far from over, and though I had been gently recognized, the storm had not yet broken. I sat still, allowing the moment to unfold, aware that what had begun as humiliation was turning into something far more powerful, something Savannah could no longer control. Savannah rose from the main table like a woman moving toward a battlefield, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her face painted with a smile that was more veneer than warmth. She carried her wine glass like a shield, every step rehearsed, but betraying a tremor in her wrist. The room quieted just enough for her approach to be noticed, though no one dared to turn their head outright. I could feel the tension ripple through the air, as if the clinking of cutlery had taken on a sharper edge. She stopped before the chef's table, tilting her head slightly, her lips curving into a polite grin that did not touch her eyes. "It seems, Clara," she said, her voice pitched high and careful, "that you've managed to arrange yourself into quite the spectacle tonight." I met her gaze without flinching, keeping my hands folded neatly on the table. My voice was calm even. "I did not arrange anything. I am simply sitting where someone remembered me." The words slipped out softer than steel, but cut sharper. A ripple of whispers carried through the guests, those closest leaning forward as though the evening had turned into a theater play. Savannah's smile twitched, her shoulders stiffening, and for a flicker of a moment her mask slipped. Damien appeared then, as if summoned by the tension itself. He approached with his hands clasped behind his back, his chef's jacket immaculate despite the heat of the kitchen. "There are certain guests," he said, his tone measured yet firm, "who never need an invitation. They are already part of the foundation of this place." A hush fell across the room, the kind of silence that magnifies the smallest sound. Savannah's eyes darted from him to me, a flash of disbelief breaking through her composure. She tried to laugh, but it came out brittle like glass about to crack. "Well, that is generous of you, Chef." She managed her words thinly veiled. "Not every contribution needs to be so public." Damien's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile remained. "Respect should never be hidden. This restaurant would not be standing as it does without Clara Mitchell." He turned to me, inclining his head in gratitude, then slipped away as quickly as he had arrived, leaving the weight of his words lingering like perfume in the air. Savannah's face flushed a deeper shade, her practiced grace fraying at the edges. A couple of guests near the main table raised their brows, while others hid their smirks behind their glasses. She shifted her wine glass from one hand to the other, searching for a retort, but none came. I leaned back in my chair, my voice steady as I spoke again. "I didn't come here to take anyone's spotlight, Savannah. I came because I was told this was a family celebration. I only sat where kindness was offered." Her lips parted as though she wanted to argue, but the words tangled before they could form. Her posture faltered, shoulders curving in slightly as though the room itself pressed against her. Aunt Lorraine, never one to stay silent in moments of tension, leaned across me with a grin sharp enough to slice through the air. "If you ask me," she said loudly enough for those around to hear, "this place has been a long time coming to honor Clara. Some truths can't be buried no matter how deep people try." The effect was immediate. A burst of quiet laughter rose from one corner, quickly stifled, but not before Savannah's head whipped toward the sound. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, unwilling to intervene, unwilling to defend me or his wife. Savannah swallowed hard, her throat moving visibly, her smile returning in a stiff imitation of poise. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper audible only to me. "You may think this is a victory, Clara, but don't forget whose family this really is." I held her gaze, my voice even softer, yet carrying more weight. Families are built on more than names on invitations. Her eyes flashed, and for a moment I thought she might snap, might let her mask fall completely, but instead she stepped back, lifting her chin and forcing her lips into a curve. "Enjoy your evening," she said, the words edged with venom she could not hide. She turned sharply, heels striking the floor with clipped finality as she returned to the main table. Conversations resumed cautiously, the air charged with the aftershocks of the confrontation. Some guests pretended nothing had happened, others exchanged knowing glances, and a few, I noticed, looked at me with newfound respect. Lorraine chuckled beside me, shaking her head. "She will stew in that for the rest of the night." "You kept your dignity, Clara. That's what stings her the most." I took another sip of wine, my hands steady, though my heart thudded heavily in my chest. I had not come to win a battle, but the moment had unfolded into one all the same. The truth was simple. For once, Savannah had been forced to stand on uncertain ground, and she did not know how to balance. I looked across the room, past the main table, past the chatter and the glances toward the portraits on the wall of Charleston's old streets. I thought of the years I had carried myself quietly, of the moments I had swallowed back words in the name of peace. Tonight, I realized peace did not always mean silence. The evening pressed forward, music swelling again from the quartet, the clatter of plates resuming, but the energy had shifted. I could feel it in the way guests leaned toward one another, in the way Savannah avoided my gaze, in the way Daniel sat caught between guilt and fear. I remained seated, poised, steady, the storm inside me settling into calm. For the first time in years, I had not been erased, and for the first time, Savannah had been unmasked. It was not yet the end, but it was enough to remind me of the ground I still stood on. The music swelled again, as if to mend the crack that had just split the evening, but no melody could smooth over the unease threading its way through the room. I noticed Grace Savannah's closest friend from college push her chair back abruptly. She muttered something under her breath. Her face stiff, then slipped away from the main table with a sweep of her silk dress. Sheridan, one of Daniel's colleagues who had always been fond of Savannah's charm, frowned openly and shifted in his seat, clearly irritated that the polished facade of the celebration was faltering. I stayed quiet at the chef's table, my wine glass cool against my fingertips, watching every detail unfold like a stage play I had been unwillingly cast into. The chatter grew uneven, hushed in pockets and sharp in others, until Ethan's voice cut through it like a knife. "If you don't sign those papers, Daniel, you can forget about peace." His tone was low at first, but sharpened with every word, and the heads of nearby guests snapped in their direction. Daniel's fork clattered against his plate, his face paling as if the air had been drained from him. He leaned closer to Ethan, his jaw tight, trying to silence him with a whisper. But Ethan only straightened in his chair, his eyes glinting with impatience. "This isn't just between us anymore, brother-in-law. You've stretched it long enough." Gasps rippled from the guests seated nearest. Sheridan glanced toward me with thinly veiled curiosity while others tried to pretend they hadn't heard. Daniel's hand trembled against his glass, but his lips pressed shut, no words daring to surface. I studied my son, a heaviness swelling in my chest. His silence screamed louder than any protest. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and the tension between Ethan's threat and Daniel's refusal told me the shadow of it was larger than one argument. Aunt Lorraine leaned close to me, whispering behind her napkin. "Did you hear that 50 people in this room just did?" "What's he talking about, Clara?" I kept my expression steady, though my pulse quickened. I didn't have answers yet, only pieces. Ethan's words carried the weight of debts, contracts, something tied to money or property, and I knew deep down Savannah's family had their hands in it. Ethan rose slightly in his chair, his voice louder this time. "You think you can hide behind that wife of yours, but paper speaks louder than excuses. Either you sign or you face the fallout." Daniel's shoulders hunched, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring himself. He still didn't speak, his silence hanging heavier with every second. The guests shifted, murmuring behind their hands. The party had slipped from celebration into spectacle, and everyone could sense it. I forced myself to breathe, to keep my composure. My mind whirred back to the odd papers I had seen months earlier when I stopped by Daniel's house to drop off Christmas gifts for the children. A folder had been left on the counter, names and figures scrawled across the top lines about property titles and shares. Savannah had whisked it away too quickly, her voice sharp, as she told me it was just office work. But now Ethan's accusations threaded too neatly with that memory. Sheridan leaned toward Ethan, trying to hush him, but Ethan shoved his hand away. "Don't tell me to calm down. I've carried his promises long enough." A nervous laugh broke out at the main table, someone desperate to cover the awkwardness, but no one joined. Instead, a silence wrapped the room again, taut and suffocating. I caught Daniel's eyes for a fleeting second. He looked lost, cornered, and younger than I had seen him in years. My heart clenched, yet I felt anger simmer beneath the sorrow. This was not the man I had raised to stand tall. This was a man ensnared, tangled in deals I had not been allowed to see. Lorraine muttered, "Trouble's been sitting at that table longer than we thought." I pressed my lips together, not answering. The night was unraveling, and with it the carefully built illusions Savannah had worked so hard to uphold. Grace had already abandoned the scene, Sheridan's patience was thinning, and Ethan had thrown the first spark into the dry field of whispers. Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Not here, Ethan. but Ethan leaned back in his chair, grinning like a wolf who had already tasted blood.
"Oh, it's here, Daniel. It's right here where everyone can see you for what you are."
The words rang in my ears, sharp and merciless. The clinking glasses, the polished silverware, the curated music, all of it had faded behind the simple, devastating truth. Something dangerous was buried in my son's silence, and Ethan had no intention of letting it stay buried. I looked around the room at the wide eyes, the stiff backs, the murmured guesses passing between strangers, and I knew then that the story was no longer only about a forgotten seat at a table. It was about something larger, something rooted in money and power, in signatures that could alter the course of everything Daniel had. The suspicion hardened in me, solid and undeniable. I had been erased from birthdays, from holidays, from moments with my grandchildren. And now I saw why. There were things they did not want me to know, things they were desperate to keep hidden. The evening pressed forward, but the air was too fractured to mend. The guests tried to return to their meals, yet every clink of cutlery felt hollow. Savannah's smile had cracked beyond repair. Daniel sat frozen in shame, and Ethan's smugness hovered like smoke over a fire not yet extinguished. I kept my eyes on them all, calm on the outside but storming within. The mask had slipped, if only slightly, but it was enough. Enough for me to know that the truth was circling closer, and that Daniel's choice, whatever it was, would change everything. 3 days later, the spring air felt damp and heavy when I opened my front door and found Elise Parker standing there with a folder clutched against her chest. Her eyes carried a strange urgency, the kind that made me step aside before I even asked what this was about. She moved quickly into my living room, placing the folder on the coffee table like it was a fragile relic. "Clara, I wasn't sure if I should bring this," she said, her voice low, "but you deserve to know." I sat across from her, my palms pressed tight against my knees. Elise had always been sharp, practical, the kind of neighbor who never wasted time on gossip. If she was here, it meant something serious. She opened the folder and slid a document toward me. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but clear enough to read. "Rachel Ann Sawyer," I whispered. The name felt foreign on my tongue, yet familiar at the same time. Elise nodded, tapping the birth certificate. Born in 1995, Augusta, Georgia. Mother listed as Pamela Sawyer. No father named. I looked up at her, my heart racing. "This isn't Savannah." Elise pulled another paper from the folder, a photograph creased with age. The picture showed a teenage girl standing in front of a dented trailer, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her smile thin and guarded, and beside her, a lanky boy with restless eyes. "Ethan," I murmured. "Exactly," Elise replied. "That's Savannah, or Rachel, as she was then. She grew up in that trailer park with him. They were inseparable." I stared at the photo, the image cutting deeper with every second. Savannah, who had always spoken with disdain about people who didn't measure up, who looked down on me with a kind of polished cruelty, had once stood barefoot in gravel outside a rusted trailer. Elise continued, her voice firm but careful. She changed her name in her early 20s. She moved away, built a new identity, and never looked back. But some of us remember. I worked at a clinic in Augusta around that time. I saw her come in with her mother more than once. The room seemed to close in on me. Memories of Savannah's sharp comments, her dismissive glances, her insistence on distancing Daniel from me, all shifted into something new. It wasn't hatred because she thought I was beneath her. It was hatred because I reminded her of where she came from. "She sees herself in me," I whispered, more to myself than to Elise. Elise nodded slowly. She spent years burying who she was, and the more she buried it, the more she needed someone else to carry the weight of her shame. That someone was you. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the ache bloom in a way I hadn't expected. Anger had fueled me for so long, anger at being dismissed, excluded, erased. But now, sitting with that photograph, all I saw was a girl who had clawed her way out of a childhood she couldn't bear to face, and who punished me for being the mirror she could not break. Elise leaned closer. "There's more. Ethan has been using her past against her, threatening to expose it if she doesn't keep feeding him money. That's what this whole financial mess is about." The puzzle snapped together with terrifying clarity. Daniel wasn't just caught in poor decisions. He was trapped in Savannah's battle to keep her past hidden, a past Ethan dangled over her like a weapon. I set the photo back on the table, my fingers trembling. For so long I had thought of Savannah as cold, calculating a woman who simply wanted to erase me. But this truth shifted everything. She wasn't just cruel. She was afraid. Elise touched my arm. "I thought you should have this before things go any further." "Thank you," I said, my voice soft, though my mind churned. When she left, I stayed seated, staring at the folder. The house was quiet, only the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I closed my eyes and let the truth settle. Savannah's cruelty had wounded me, cut deep into the life I had tried so hard to protect. But now I saw her not as the untouchable woman she wanted the world to see, but as Rachel Ann Sawyer, a girl from a trailer park who had run so far from her beginnings she could never look back. I felt the weight of years of resentment start to shift. The anger loosened its grip, replaced with something unexpected, something close to pity. Because in the end, it wasn't me she despised most. It was herself. I stood and carried the folder to my desk, sliding it into the drawer. The evidence was there, undeniable, and it would matter in the days ahead. But for now, I simply let myself breathe. The woman who had made me feel invisible had built her whole life on pretending her own history was invisible too. For the first time in years, I no longer felt small under her gaze. Instead, I saw her clearly, and the sight filled me not with fury, but with a quiet, almost sorrowful understanding. The knock at my door came late in the evening, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet. I hesitated before opening it, but when I saw Daniel standing there with his shoulders slumped and his eyes rimmed red, I knew something inside him had broken. He looked smaller than the man I remembered, not in stature, but in spirit, like the weight he carried had finally crushed him. "Mom, can I come in?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. I stepped aside and he walked in slowly, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets as though he needed to hold himself together. He didn't sit right away, just stood in the middle of the living room staring at the carpet. "I can't do it anymore," he said finally. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine." I waited, letting the silence draw out until he found the courage to continue. He rubbed his hands over his face and dropped into the chair across from me. "Savannah and Ethan have been pressuring me," he said. "They want me to sign over the trust Dad left. They say it's the only way to cover the investment Ethan lost, but it isn't just about the money. It's about control. They want everything tied to this family to run through them." His words spilled out faster, his composure unraveling with each confession. He admitted that Savannah had cornered him more than once, whispering about loyalty and image, while Ethan used threats and veiled reminders of debts Daniel could never fully pay back. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, Daniel said, his voice cracking, that if I signed the papers, things would calm down. But then I thought about Emily and Jacob. What if something happens to me, Mom? What if they're left with nothing because I gave it all away to protect a lie? My chest tightened at the mention of my grandchildren. I leaned forward, my voice steady but firm. "If you sign those papers, Daniel, you're not just handing away money. You're giving up your children's future." That trust was meant to protect you and them. It wasn't meant to be bargaining chips for Ethan or Savannah. He dropped his head into his hands.
I know. God, I know. I've been so blind. I let Savannah push me further and further away from you, and I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping the peace. But all I did was hurt you. And now I see how much I've been hurting myself, too.
The tears slipped from his eyes, and I felt the ache of years between us. I reached across the table and laid my hand over his. The warmth of his skin, the tremor in his fingers reminded me that beneath his mistakes he was still the boy I had raised, the one I had fought so hard to give a better life. Daniel, it's not too late. You have a choice right now. You can either keep feeding their power, or you can stand up for yourself and your children. The law is on your side if you don't sign. But if you do, undoing it will be a nightmare. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine like a drowning man reaching for air. What if Savannah leaves me? What if I lose my family? I squeezed his hand tighter. If she only stays because you give in, then what kind of family is that? Family isn't about control. It's about love, even when it's hard. His shoulders shook, and for the first time in years, he cried openly in front of me. I let him, offering no judgment, only quiet strength. The boy who had once clung to me after his father died was still inside him, and tonight he let that boy speak. After a long silence, he straightened, wiping his face with his sleeve. You're right. I can't let them take everything. I can't let them define me anymore. He stood pacing the room with a new kind of energy. I'm going to tell Ethan no. And Savannah, if she can't stand by me when I protect what's ours, then maybe she never really stood by me at all. The words hit the air like a vow, and though his voice trembled, there was steel underneath it. I rose from my chair and placed a hand on his arm. Daniel, whatever happens, I'm with you. Always. He nodded, his jaw set, and for the first time in years, I saw not just the man he had become, but the man he could be if he chose courage over fear. That night, as he left my house with his shoulders a little straighter, I felt a shift inside me. The distance that had grown between us wasn't gone, but it had begun to close. He had chosen, and his choice had pulled him back toward me. When the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The battle ahead was far from over, but Daniel had finally taken the first step. And that choice, fragile as it was, changed everything. Word traveled faster than I expected, as if the walls of Maison Charleston had carried every whisper out into the streets of the city. Within a few days, I heard from a neighbor that a local food column had published a story about the anniversary dinner, not with photographs of Savannah's elegant decorations or praise for Daniel's speeches, but with a headline that stopped me in my tracks. It read, "The Quiet Force Behind Charleston's Favorite Kitchen." My name was in the first paragraph, described as the woman who had once helped a struggling young chef survive his hardest days, and whose presence that night reminded everyone that true generosity never fades. I read the article twice, my hands trembling slightly. The writer quoted Chef Damien, who spoke of loyalty and memory, not extravagance. The piece wasn't flashy, but it carried weight, and soon more papers picked it up, repeating the story of the forgotten guest who became the special guest. Meanwhile, the consequences for Savannah began to unfold like falling dominoes. At first, she tried to spin the evening as a misunderstanding. She told a few of her friends that the restaurant had mixed up the seating, that I had made a scene. But the whispers grew louder, especially after more people at the dinner confirmed what they saw. By the end of the week, I heard from Elise that Savannah's design firm had pulled back from renewing a contract with her, citing concerns about her professionalism. Clients she used to meet for brunch stopped returning her calls. The shimmer of her social world dulled, and though I felt no joy in seeing her stumble, I couldn't ignore the sense that karma had begun its quiet work. Ethan's troubles deepened more publicly. Word of his debts started surfacing when one of his creditors filed papers in court. A friend of Daniel's from college sent him a message saying Ethan's name was circulating around town tied to bad checks and risky investments. I overheard Daniel reading a text aloud one evening, his voice mixed with disbelief and a trace of grim satisfaction. "They're saying Ethan's being investigated for fraud. Someone tipped off the authorities after that scene at the restaurant." I thought of the way Ethan's voice had cracked with impatience that night, his threats sharp enough for half the room to hear. Now those words had become evidence of his unraveling. The same arrogance that had made him bold was now dragging him into the light. In the middle of all this, Daniel began bringing Emily and Jacob to see me more often. The first time they rushed through my front door, their laughter filling the living room, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Emily tugged at my sleeve, begging me to bake cookies with her while Jacob curled up on the couch with one of the storybooks I used to read to Daniel when he was young. Those visits became regular, each one stitching back together pieces of the family I thought I had lost. One Sunday afternoon, while Jacob napped in the spare room and Emily colored at the kitchen table, Daniel leaned against the counter sipping coffee. "It feels different here, Mom," he said quietly. "I feel like I can breathe when I'm in this house. With Savannah, everything is about appearances. Here it's just real." I nodded, not needing to say much. The house wasn't fancy, but it held something more precious: acceptance. He knew it, and I knew he was beginning to measure the contrast more clearly every day. As the weeks passed, friends and acquaintances reached out with words that surprised me. Messages on my phone said things like, "Saw your name in the paper," "Proud of you," and "You've always had more grace than people realized." Even Aunt Lorraine called one morning to laugh about how the story had taken on a life of its own. "Clara, you're practically a local legend now," she teased, though I could hear the sincerity beneath her chuckle. Through it all, Savannah grew quieter. I saw fewer updates from her on social media, fewer photos of glamorous outings and picture-perfect family dinners. The silence said more than any public statement could. I imagined her circle shrinking, the polite excuses stacking up as people chose distance over association. Ethan's downfall was louder. I passed by the courthouse one day and caught sight of him on the steps, his suit wrinkled, his expression haggard. Reporters shouted questions he refused to answer, and the cameras caught every moment. Later, a friend showed me the footage online. It spread quickly, another reminder that some debts are too heavy to hide. At night, when the house was still, I sometimes replayed everything in my mind. I thought of how Daniel had finally chosen to stand with me, of how Emily's small hand felt in mine when she whispered, "Grandma, can I come again tomorrow?" and of the quiet justice unfolding around Savannah and Ethan. It wasn't fast or dramatic like the movies, but it was steady and it was real. I didn't crave their suffering, but I did believe in consequences. The world had a way of balancing itself, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully. What had once felt like my own private humiliation had become a public story. And not because I shouted it, but because truth has a way of rising, even when people try to bury it. One evening, Daniel sat across from me at the table after the kids had gone to bed. He looked tired, but there was peace in his eyes. "Do you think I'll ever be able to fix it all, Mom?" I reached across and touched his hand. "You don't have to fix everything at once. You just have to keep choosing what's right. The rest will follow." The clock ticked softly in the background as we sat there, mother and son, the distance between us smaller than it had been in years. Outside, Charleston moved at its usual pace, but inside that room I felt the slow turning of justice. It wasn't loud or vengeful. It was measured, steady, and in its own way merciful. And as I watched Daniel gather his things to leave, promising to bring the children again next weekend, I knew the story wasn't about Savannah's downfall or Ethan's disgrace. It was about the quiet strength that survives even when people try to erase it, and how in time the world notices. The first real evening of calm came when I decided to host a dinner of my own. After weeks of watching the storm settle and hearing bits of news about Savannah and Ethan fading into silence, I felt it was time to create something that belonged only to me and the people I trusted. My small house near the coast of Sullivan's Island was not fancy, but it held warmth, and I wanted that warmth to be shared around a table. I spent the morning preparing dishes that carried memories. I pulled out the old recipe card with my mother's handwriting, the ink faded but still legible for her peach cobbler. I simmered a roast in the oven with garlic and rosemary, the smell filling the house until even I felt like a guest in my own kitchen. A bottle of Syrah rested on the counter, chosen carefully for the depth of flavor that reminded me of old celebrations, ones that were never about appearances, but about togetherness. When Daniel arrived with Emily and Jacob, their laughter broke the quiet of the house like sunlight after rain. Emily rushed in first, holding a drawing she had made for me, while Jacob carried a basket of fresh rolls they had picked up from the bakery. Daniel kissed my cheek, his eyes softer than I had seen them in years. Aunt Lorraine followed soon after, her voice booming as she complimented the smell and teased that she hoped she brought her appetite. Chef Damien arrived with two of his apprentices, young men eager but respectful, their faces glowing with gratitude when I welcomed them. He carried a bottle of his own and gave me a quick embrace. "Tonight, Clara, we sit at your table," he said, his tone full of the same sincerity that had marked him since the beginning of our friendship. I had set the table in the dining room where the windows faced the ocean. The light was fading to pink, the waves steady in the distance, and I felt a swell of peace just looking out. At the end of the table, I had placed a chair left empty. No plate, no glass, only a simple folded napkin resting on it. When Aunt Lorraine asked about it, I smiled gently. That chair is for anyone who understands respect. There is always room here for people who carry that with them. We sat together as the food was served. Emily told stories from school. Jacob asked Chef Damien if he knew how to make pizza, which made everyone laugh, and Aunt Lorraine launched into memories of her youth that made even the young apprentices grin. The wine poured easily, the food was passed back and forth, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the fullness of family again, not in names or titles, but in spirit. Daniel raised his glass at one point, his voice steady though his eyes were damp. "To Mom, for teaching me what matters, for showing me that respect and honesty aren't optional, and for making this home feel like the safest place in the world." He looked at me as he spoke, and in that gaze I saw the boy I had raised and the man who had found his way back. I touched my glass to his, then to the others, and the sound rang clear. I didn't need grand speeches. The simple truth was enough. Later, as dessert was served, the cobbler warm and sweet, I watched Emily sneak an extra spoonful and Jacob lick the sugar from his fingers, and I thought of how different this table felt from the one I had sat near at Maison Charleston. That night I had been made invisible, a guest forgotten in plain sight. Tonight, I was the center, not because of spotlight or prestige, but because love and respect had found their rightful place. Chef Damien caught my eye and smiled knowingly. He said softly, so only I could hear, See, Clara, some tables choose their guests, and some guests choose the right table. The evening lingered with laughter and the kind of conversations that flow when people feel safe. I let myself soak in every sound, every glance, every flicker of candlelight. The empty chair at the end of the table remained untouched, but its presence spoke louder than any guest could have. It was a reminder that dignity has space of its own, that the ones who honor it will always be welcome, and the ones who don't will notice the absence. As the night drew to a close and the dishes were stacked in the sink, Daniel hugged me longer than usual before taking the children home. Aunt Lorraine kissed my forehead, telling me she had not eaten this well in years. The apprentices shook my hand with gratitude, and Chef Damien promised we would share many more meals together. When the door finally closed and I stood alone in the quiet, I looked back at the table, the glasses still half full, the candle wax melted low, the empty chair glowing faintly in the last light. My heart felt full, not of pride, but of peace. From a forgotten guest, I had become a special guest, not because anyone crowned me, but because I had claimed my own table, my own worth, and my own voice. And that dinner filled with laughter and love would be the one my daughter-in-law would never forget, not because she was there, but because she was not. If you followed me through this story, I would love to hear your thoughts. What does family mean to you, and how do you define respect and justice at your own table? Share your feelings, because these stories belong to all of us, and together we can keep the conversation alive.